Before the sun ever rose, before men walked beneath open skies, the world was shrouded in twilight, a land between the shadows of night and the golden promise of day. In these ancient times, a single being's defiance would change the fate of all who came after her. Her name was Arien. Arien, a Maya, a spirit of fire, was one of the mightiest among her kind. Her flames so pure and fierce that they could melt even the hardest metals of the great forge of Aule. Yet, unlike many of her kindred spirits, she remained unyielding, untouched by the darkness that would soon spread through Valinor. While other fire spirits fell into shadow, corrupted by the whispers of Melkor, turning into the fearsome Balrogs that would terrorize the world for ages, Arien stood unwavering, her flame bright as ever. Even Melkor, the Dark Lord himself, found her light too pure to corrupt, a light that burned with a brilliance that was impossible to dim. Arien moved through the golden gardens of Vana, the ever-young. The gardens were a place of eternal spring, where the air smelled of blooming flowers, and the rivers sparkled like liquid crystal. Here, she served as a handmaiden to Vana, tending to the immortal flowers that blossomed in the light of the trees. Laurelin, the golden tree, and Telperion, the silver tree. Every morning, she gathered the luminous dew of Laurelin in crystal vessels, so pure they seemed spun from solid light. The dew itself seemed to recognize Arian's presence, glowing brighter as if honoring her kindred spirit. As she moved through the garden, the flowers seemed to respond to her touch. Each drop of Laurelin's light fell onto the blossoms, causing them to unfurl like tiny mirrors reflecting the golden light. The Eldar, the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, who dwelt in Valinor alongside her, could not help but look in awe at her radiant presence. Even they, immortal and fair beyond measure, learned to avert their eyes when Arien passed. The brilliance of her gaze was too intense, like staring directly into the heart of a forge. No being could long endure the sight of her, and few could come close without feeling the heat of her being. Arian's flame was not simply a symbol of beauty and purity, it was the essence of her power, an essence that was untainted by the corruption that had begun to poison the hearts of her kin. Though many of the Maiar had fallen under Melkor's influence, turning their light to darkness and becoming the dreadful Balrogs, Arien had remained steadfast. She had not succumbed to the lies whispered by the Dark Lord, nor had she been swayed by his promises of power. While others of her kind had embraced the temptations of shadow, she had remained loyal to the Valar and to the pure flame that burned within her. However, Arien knew that darkness was stirring in the world. A new presence had emerged, one that had the power to unravel everything she held dear. Melkor, long imprisoned for his rebellion against the will of the Valar, had been released from his chains. The Valar, believing that he had repented for his transgressions, allowed him to return to Valinor. They saw his bowing head as a sign of reformation, but Arien, knowing the nature of the Dark Lord, could not ignore the growing unease that stirred in her heart. The shadows of his malice would soon return to consume all that was pure and good in the world. One day, as she worked in the gardens, Arien felt a disturbance in the air. She sensed a dark presence approaching, and soon Melkor himself appeared, walking through the lush paths of Vana's gardens. His steps were measured, his expression humble. His voice, once full of power and authority, now spoke in softer tones, as though he had indeed been changed. But days later, Melkor returned, and this time his voice had changed. It was no longer humble or meek, but rich with the promise of power. His words seemed to weave visions of dominion, of vast armies that would kneel to Arian's command, of flames that could reshape the very world. As he spoke, the air thickened, and Arien felt the oppressive weight of his promises pressing in on her. It was not the language of peace, but one of conquest, of rebellion. The very essence of his being seemed to twist the air around him, and for a moment, the golden flowers around Arien withered, as if touched by his darkness. Arien rose to face him, her form glowing brighter than the sun, a blaze of pure fire that filled the garden with its intensity. The contrast between them could not have been starker. Arian's light was fierce, untamed, and yet pure, while Melkor's shadow was heavy, oppressive, and corrupt. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as though the very earth itself was caught between the battle of light and darkness. Melkor's darkness surged toward her, but Arien did not falter. Her flame met his shadow, and the two forces clashed with such power that the very air seemed to crack and shatter. The battle raged, and though Melkor's shadow pressed against Arian's light, she did not yield. Her flame held steady, and in the end, Melkor's darkness was driven back. The garden around them was left in ruin, the flowers withered, and the once lush paths now lay barren. But Melkor, having been repelled, disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but a lingering chill. Arien, shaken by the confrontation but resolute in her purpose, knew that this was just the beginning. Melkor's darkness had not been defeated, only momentarily driven back. As she moved through the gardens, a sense of urgency gripped her. She must warn the Valar. But the halls of Valinor were alive with preparations for a great feast, and the words of warning she carried were left unspoken. Days passed, and the peace of Valinor continued, but the seeds of darkness had been sown. Melkor would return, and Arian knew that the light of the Valar would be tested as never before. The whisper of shadows. The days in Valinor were long and peaceful, and the bliss of the blessed realm lingered like a perpetual spring, untouched by sorrow or suffering. Yet, there was a whisper in the air, a murmur that only a few could sense, Arien among them. Her flame, always attuned to the pulse of the world, had felt a coldness in the air ever since Melkor's return. It was faint at first, but it grew with each passing day. Arien walked through the halls of Valinor's great cities, her presence a soft yet undeniable radiance in the sea of tranquil faces. But no matter how serene the people appeared, Arien could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadows in the corner of her vision seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the heart of the land, as though the very earth was subtly shifting under the influence of an unseen hand. She knew it wasn't just Melkor's return that caused this stir, but something darker, something deeper. In the midst of this growing unease, the Valar convened. The halls of their council were adorned with the brilliant tapestries of light, woven from the radiance of Laurelin and Telperion. But in the air between them, a heavy silence lingered. Melkor, despite his assurances of reformation, had not been entirely forthcoming. His influence was already spreading, though most refused to see it. The Valar, too often blinded by their hope for peace, did not yet realize that darkness had already begun to take root in the hearts of some. Manwë, the High King of the Valar, sat at the head of the council, his gentle but authoritative voice resonating through the hall. "There are those among us who speak of unrest," he said, turning his gaze to Arien. "What do you sense, Lady of the Flame?" Arien stepped forward, her voice steady, though her heart was heavy with the weight of her words. "I sense a shadow, one that grows ever closer. It is not only Melkor's influence, but something older, something deeper. His whispers are already seeping into the hearts of the Maiar and Eldar alike, turning them to doubt and fear." The council fell silent, the Valar listening closely to Arian's warning. Arien had long been a voice of reason, known for her clarity in seeing things others could not. And yet, despite her words, many of the Valar remained unconvinced. "What we need," said Vada, the Lady of the Stars, "is unity. Our light will drive back any shadow, as it has done before." But Arien could not shake the feeling that the darkness Melkor had set into motion was not so easily banished. "Unity is important," she replied, her voice tinged with an edge of warning. "But without vigilance, unity becomes a weakness. The shadow will not be so easily turned away this time." As the meeting broke up, the tension in the air remained. Arien knew in her heart that the time had come to act. She could no longer wait for the Valar to realize the danger that loomed over them. With the cold weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, she prepared to leave Valinor. If the Valar would not listen, she would seek out the wisdom of the Eldar and the Maiar, who lived beyond the borders of the Blessed Realm. The journey beyond the shores. The decision to leave Valinor was not an easy one for Arian. The Blessed Realm, with its beauty and peace, had been her home for countless ages. Yet, she could not stand by while shadows crept closer to the heart of all that was good and pure in the world. With a heavy heart, she gathered her belongings, taking only what she needed for her journey. A crystal vial containing the purest dew of Lorelin, a flame that would guide her in the darkest places, and a single cloak woven from the silver strands of Telperion. With a heavy heart, Arian stepped onto the shores of Valinor, the golden sands beneath her feet glistening like the last remnants of the sun's light. As she gazed out across the sea, the waters stretched before her, vast, endless, and unknown. Beyond these shores lay Middle-earth, a land where the shadows of Melkor had already begun to take root. It was to this land that Arian was bound. Her journey was not one of solitude. She had gathered a small group of allies, each of them willing to join her in the perilous journey beyond the confines of Valinor. Among them was Eönwe, the herald of the Valar, whose silver voice could command the winds. And there was Ermo, the Valar of dreams and visions, whose gift of foresight was invaluable, though his visions had recently been clouded by an unsettling fog. Together, they would make their way across the sea to Middle-earth, to confront the growing darkness before it could take full form. As they sailed away from Valinor, Arian's heart felt torn. She knew that by leaving, she was forsaking the safety of the Blessed Realm, but it was a sacrifice she had to make. She could not allow the shadow to spread unchecked, for it would eventually reach even the sacred lands of the Valar, the land of shadows. The journey across the sea was long, and the further they sailed from Valinor, the more oppressive the air became. The skies, once clear and brilliant, were now veiled with clouds that seemed to dim the light, and the waters grew darker, as though the very sea was mourning the loss of their departure. Arien could feel the change in the air, the pull of the shadows growing stronger with each passing day. When they finally arrived in Middle-earth, the land greeted them with a strange stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken history. Here, the touch of Melkor was unmistakable. His influence had spread far and wide, twisting the once beautiful forests and fields into dark, foreboding places. In the northern reaches of the land, in the desolate region known as Angband, Arian and her companions found evidence of the great fortress Melkor had built during his first rebellion. It was a place of deep corruption, a reflection of the Dark Lord's twisted soul. The very stones of Angband seemed to groan under the weight of ancient evil. Arian could feel the presence of Melkor here, his influence still lingering, even though he was not yet fully present. It was a place where even the land itself seemed to resist the purity of her flame. The closer they came to the fortress, the darker the world seemed to grow, as though the land itself was drawing the darkness into its heart. The battle of flame and shadow. As they journeyed further into Middle-earth, Arian's companions began to feel the full weight of Melkor's influence. Eönwe, once the herald of the Valar, found himself reluctant to speak, as though a great sorrow had taken root in his heart. Ermo, the Valar of dreams, had fallen into a deep, restless sleep, plagued by visions of doom. Only Arian remained resolute, her flame bright against the growing darkness. They were not alone, however. In the deep woods of the east, they encountered a group of elves, those who had fallen under the sway of Melkor and who had been corrupted by his promises of power. These dark elves, led by the ambitious Fëanor, saw Arian and her companions as enemies to their master. Arian fought with all her might, her flame blazing like the sun itself as she drove back the dark elves. The clash of light and shadow was felt across the land, a battle that would shape the fate of Middle-earth for ages to come. Her flame burned through the night, and though the dark elves fought valiantly, they could not withstand the power of the light she wielded. But as the battle raged, Arian knew this was only a small victory. Melkor's darkness was vast and insidious, and though she had won this fight, the war was far from over. Arian's heart burned with determination, for she knew that the final confrontation was yet to come. The darkness could not be allowed to spread any further. The heart of darkness. The battle at the edges of the east was just a harbinger of the trials that lay ahead. Though Arian and her companions had defeated the Dark Elves loyal to Melkor, it was evident that their victory had been but a small flicker in the overwhelming darkness that now engulfed Middle-earth. As they continued their journey, they ventured deeper into lands where Melkor's touch had tainted the earth itself, transforming once verdant forests into twisted, gnarled wastelands. The farther they ventured into the heart of the land, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, as if it was soaked with sorrow and despair. Rivers that once sparkled with clear waters now ran with dark, stagnant sludge, and mountains that once stood as proud sentinels were now crumbling ruins, eroded by the poison of Melkor's influence. Even the stars above seemed duller, as though their light was dimmed by the weight of the looming shadow. In the heart of the land, they came upon the ruins of an ancient city, a once thriving place where the first of the elves had settled after awakening in the days of the world's youth. The city was now desolate, its towering spires broken, and its streets choked with weeds. The city's heart, a massive marble temple dedicated to the Valar, had been defiled, its sacred spaces twisted into places of dark ritual. Arien stood at the entrance of the temple, her heart heavy with grief. "This is where the first elves of this world made their home," she whispered, her voice soft as the wind. "This place was once a beacon of hope for all the children of Eru, but now it stands as a testament to the depths of Melkor's corruption." Iornwyr stood beside her, his brow furrowed as he gazed into the ruins. "Melkor's reach has spread far, Arian, and it's not just the land he's corrupted, it's the hearts of the people too. Those who once sang of the stars now speak only in whispers, their eyes clouded by the lies he has fed them." Arian nodded, feeling the weight of his words. The darkness that Melkor had sowed wasn't just an external force. It was an infection that spread within the hearts of those he touched. And unless they could find a way to stop it, there would be no realm left untouched by his evil. They pressed on, leaving the ruins behind them, but Arian could not shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come, the unseen enemy. As they moved deeper into the land, Arian and her companions began to notice something peculiar. The land itself seemed to fight them. The winds, which had once been gentle, now howled with strange, unnatural fury. "There's something watching us," Ermo said one evening, his voice heavy with dread. He had been silent for much of the journey, but now his eyes, clouded by visions, burned with an intensity that was rare for him. "We are not alone." Eornwyr turned to look at him, concern etched across his features. "What do you mean? Who is watching us?" Ermo closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as if trying to peer beyond the veil of the physical world. Arian's pulse quickened as she too felt the presence of something unnatural, a force that moved just beyond the edge of her perception. It was as if the very air was thick with malice, and the land itself held its breath, waiting for something terrible to occur. They pressed on, but Arian knew in her heart that the land had turned against them. Melkor's power had twisted more than just the physical realm. It had warped the very fabric of the world itself, the betrayal of the fallen. In the distance, Arian could see the faint outline of a dark fortress rising from the earth. This was the stronghold of the fallen, where the most corrupt of Melkor's followers had gathered, those who had once been noble but had fallen prey to the promises of power and domination. Among these followers was one who had once been a trusted ally of the Valar, Fëanor, the brilliant but arrogant elf who had once crafted the Silmarils, the most powerful and beautiful of jewels ever created. But now, Fëanor had been corrupted by Melkor's lies, his heart filled with bitterness and rage. Arian and her companions approached the fortress cautiously, aware of the danger that lurked within. As they drew nearer, they were confronted by a group of dark elves, their eyes filled with an unnatural gleam. At their head was Fëanor, his once beautiful face now twisted with hatred. "Arian," Fëanor said, his voice cold and mocking. "You still cling to your pathetic light, even now, as it fades before the might of Melkor. How foolish you are." Arien stood tall, her flame blazing brightly in the face of his scorn. "It is you who are foolish, Fëanor. You have turned your back on all that is good and pure in this world. You have allowed Melkor to twist your heart." Fëanor laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "You cannot understand, Arian. The Valar are weak. They offer nothing but false promises. Melkor has shown me the truth. Power, not light, is what will shape this world." With a sudden, violent motion, Fëanor raised his hand, and a torrent of dark energy surged toward Arian. But before it could strike, Eärnwy stepped forward, his voice ringing out like a bell of doom. "We will not be swayed by your lies, Fëanor. The light of the Valar will shine brighter than any darkness you can summon." The clash that followed was a battle of light against shadow, with Fëanor and his followers wielding the dark powers granted to them by Melkor. Arien fought with all her might, her flame burning bright against the cold darkness of the fallen elves. But despite her strength, she could feel the weight of betrayal pressing upon her heart. Fëanor, once a hero among the elves, had become an enemy of the light. The siege of Angband. The battle with Fëanor and his followers had been a harrowing one, but Arien's resolve remained unbroken. They had driven the dark elves back, but Arien knew that the true battle was still to come. They had reached Angband, the fortress of Melkor, and here, in the heart of the darkness, they would face the greatest challenge of their journey. The gates of Angband loomed before them, massive and black, as if they were the very mouth of the world's corruption. Arien and her companions stood before the gates, knowing that once they entered, there would be no turning back. "Are we ready?" Eärnwy asked, his voice calm but filled with a quiet determination. Arien nodded, her heart steeled for the battle ahead. "We must be. The fate of Middle-earth depends on what happens here." With a collective breath, they stepped forward, crossing the threshold of Angband. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls echoed with the sounds of distant, anguished cries. Melkor's power was overwhelming here, suffocating, and Arien could feel its weight pressing down upon her chest. They moved through the darkened halls of Angband, each step carrying them closer to the heart of the fortress. The deeper they went, the more Arien felt her flame flicker, as if Melkor's darkness was trying to snuff it out. At last, they reached the heart of Angband, where Melkor awaited them. The Dark Lord sat upon a throne made of black stone, his eyes glowing with malice. "So, you have come, Arian," Melkor said, his voice dripping with venom. "I knew you would, but you are too late. The world is mine, and nothing you do can stop it." Arien stepped forward, her flame burning bright as she met his gaze. "I will not let you have it, Melkor. The light will always shine, even in the darkest of times." The Shattering of the Dark. The final confrontation between Arien and Melkor was a battle that would echo through the ages. The forces of light and shadow clashed in the heart of Angband, shaking the very foundations of the world. Arien fought with all her might, her flame bright and pure, while Melkor, the master of darkness, wielded his terrible power to crush her. But despite the overwhelming strength of Melkor's malice, Arien stood firm, her heart burning with the light of the Valar. She knew that she could not defeat him alone, but with the help of her companions, she could weaken him enough to expose his true weakness. The battle was long and grueling, but in the end, it was Arien's flame that proved to be Melkor's undoing. The aftermath of victory, the dust of battle still hung in the air like a shroud over the shattered ruins of Angband. The fortress, once a symbol of Melkor's overwhelming power, lay in ruins, its once imposing gates now broken and twisted, the walls cracked and crumbling. Arien stood amidst the destruction, her flame flickering weakly, though it still shone with an unyielding light. Her companions were exhausted. Eärnwy, Ermo, and the others had fought valiantly by her side, but even their strength had been tested to the limit. The forces of darkness were gone, but the toll had been heavy. As the silence settled over the battlefield, it felt as though the very land was taking a deep breath, as though it too had been waiting for the Dark Lord's defeat. Yet even in this moment of victory, Arian couldn't shake the feeling of sorrow. The world around her was still scarred by Melkor's influence. Though Melkor had fallen, the darkness had left its mark, and it would take time, perhaps even centuries, for the world to heal. "We've won," Arian whispered, her voice barely a breath. "But at what cost?" Ianwe walked up beside her, his eyes somber. "Victory always comes with sacrifice, Arian. The cost was great, yes, but you've done what few would ever dare to. You've defeated the darkness, and now the light can begin to return." Arian nodded, though the ache in her heart remained. Her eyes swept over the battlefield, and for a moment, it seemed as if the land itself were grieving. The trees creaked mournfully, their branches swaying in the wind like the arms of mourners. Ermo, who had been deep in thought, stepped forward. His eyes glowed with a quiet understanding. "We will help the land heal. The Valar, the Maiar, all of us will work together to restore what has been broken. It will take time, but it is possible." Arian turned toward him, her eyes heavy. "And what of the people? What of the elves, the men, the dwarves? Can they ever recover from the corruption that has poisoned their hearts?" Ermo sighed. "The wounds of the heart are the hardest to heal. Some may never recover from the lies Melkor fed them, but many still hold to the light. We must nurture them, guide them back to the truth." Arian understood what Ermo was saying. The war had been won, but the battle for the hearts of the people was only beginning. There was much to rebuild, much to restore. Yet for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. She turned toward her companions. "Let us begin the healing then. The light must return to the world, one step at a time. The rebirth of the world." As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Arian and her companions worked tirelessly to heal the land. With the fall of Angband and the defeat of Melkor, the world had been freed from the grip of shadow. But the scars left by his reign were deep and far-reaching. The first steps toward restoration began with the land itself. The Valar, the Maiar, and the remaining free peoples of Middle-earth all lent their strength to the task. Together they worked to cleanse the rivers of their darkness, to restore the forests to their former splendor, and to repair the cracks in the earth that had been caused by Melkor's corruption. Eönwe, the herald of the Valar, led the effort to rebuild the cities that had fallen to the shadow, including those of the elves and the men. The once great city of Valmar, home to the Valar themselves, was carefully restored, its golden towers rising once again from the ashes. The elves, who had suffered so greatly under Melkor's influence, began to rebuild their ancient realms, finding solace in the healing of the land and in the restoration of their homes. Arian, too, had her work to do. As one of the last of the Aina, she felt a deep responsibility to guide the healing of the world. Her flame, which had been kindled by the light of the two trees in Valinor, still burned brightly, but its light had dimmed in the shadow of Melkor's evil. As the land healed, so too did her flame grow stronger, its warmth spreading across the world, a beacon of hope for all who had suffered. She traveled far and wide, speaking with the various peoples of Middle-earth, offering them the wisdom she had gained through her trials. The elves, men and dwarves alike, came to her for guidance, seeking counsel in these dark times. Arian's presence was a comfort to them, a reminder that light still existed in the world and that it was possible to rebuild even after such devastation. But there was still much to be done. The hearts of those who had fallen under Melkor's influence were not so easily healed. Many of the elves who had followed Fëanor and others who had been corrupted by Melkor still carried the bitterness and anger of their betrayal. The men, too, were divided, some still harboring the desire for power that Melkor had promised them, while others sought redemption. Together, Arian and her companions had faced the greatest evil that Middle-earth had ever known. And though the cost had been great, they had succeeded in their mission. The light had returned to the world, and with it, the possibility of healing, growth, and renewal. As the seasons passed, Arian stood on the highest peak of the mountains that once stood at the heart of Angband. The sky was clear and blue, the air fresh and full of life. Below her, the forests were slowly returning to their former glory, the rivers sparkling once again with pure water. In the distance, she could see the cities of the elves, men and dwarves beginning to thrive once more. It would take many more years, perhaps even ages, before the scars of the past were fully healed. But Arian knew that the world was on the right path. The light would guide them, and as long as there were those who held fast to it, Middle-earth would continue to flourish. With a sense of peace in her heart, Arian turned away from the peak and began her descent. The journey was far from over, but the world was no longer drowning in shadow. It had been reborn, and in its rebirth there was hope. The light had returned to Middle-earth, and as long as it did, the dark would never truly reign again.